Hi, I'm Beverly Wenger-Trayner.
And I'm Etienne Wenger-Trayner.
We are social learning theorists and consultants.
We work with organizations across sectors and regions of the world.
We're going to talk about learning. More specifically, we're going to talk about social learning.
By social learning, we mean learning as a collective process, not necessarily something informal or involving social media.
We believe that social learning, properly understood, is the key to many of the challenges we face today.
For lots of people, learning starts with something that's known, whether it's in a book, in a YouTube video, or in the head of an expert.
And that something is then transmitted to someone who doesn't know it. The person absorbs the information and now knows it.
This simple view is a learning model that only works in specific cases.
But for the projects we're involved in, this simple view doesn't work. There are too many variables. Different people are being thrown together in different ways, they come and go.
What's known in one context does not easily translate into another.
The world is moving fast, what worked yesterday doesn't work today or tomorrow. Local and global contexts are changing.
Politics come in the way, the unexpected happens.
Knowledge doesn't sit still. It lies in the inventiveness of putting things into action.
And in noticing what happens is the result.
To be learning in today's world, you need to be on your toes, constantly innovating, solving problems.
Improvising, jumping on opportunities, and bringing others along.
So we need a model of learning that applies to this dynamic and complex world we live in.
You may wonder why learning models matter.
We've seen countless projects where no one questions the learning model. They simply apply a model like the one we described before and wonder why things don't work.
Learning models matter because they guide how you support it, how you design for it, and how you evaluate it.
And if you have the wrong learning model, then some of the most important learning might even be invisible to you.
And by the way, everyone has a learning model, not just learning professionals. You might not even realize you have one. You may simply assume that learning is what you experience in school or in training.
Learning theorists have labelled some common models that influence people.
Say your learning model is a so-called behaviorist learning model. Then you believe that learning is the tuning of a response to a stimulus. Tuning is done by some kind of reward or punishment.
Did you get a star for being good at school or punished for being wrong? Do you congratulate your child when they do something you like and frown when they don't?
According to a different model, the cognitive model, learning takes place through building cognitive structures in the brain.
What you need is information, explanations and mental models to help you predict and understand the world.
In this case, you support learning by providing the appropriate information.
If your learning model is a constructivist one, then you believe that people construct their own understanding of the world.
In this picture, a mother with a cognitivist view would give a good explanation of how the tap works to bring in so much water.
A constructivist mother would propose that the little boy look under the basin, follow the pipes, and find out the answer for himself.
For a constructivist, this is the essence of learning. But a cognitivist might well question whether real learning is happening at all.
And there are many more models than these three, and most people are influenced by more than one model.
And different models are more appropriate for different situations.
But you get the point, that your everyday actions are influenced by those learning models, consciously or not. What you don't want is for your learning model to be holding up your own learning.
Or that of your organization.
We've developed our own learning model through working in many projects. It seems to work for people in dynamic and complex situations. Let's take a look.
To start with, this model assumes that these people come together, face-to-face, online, by letters, whatever, and they engage in what we call learning activities.
These activities could be a conversation, a joint project, a shared problem-solving session,
A benchmarking exercise, or countless ways to learn together. If the activities goes well, people get value just from participating.
They meet others who understand them, they talk shop.
They think together, they have fun, they get to know each other.
We call this immediate value.
Out of that, hopefully they get something. good ideas, new perspective, or unexpected solutions to their problems.
They might document some of those insights for the future.
They may also get new inspirations or new skills.
Or even a new connection with someone they can contact later.
These takeaways are the second dimension of our learning model. We call it potential value because it may improve what people do.
Or there again, it may not.
Yes, it is only a potential at this stage.
Let's imagine now that they go home and use what they got. They try something new, they change their practice, they collaborate with a new contact.
For us, this creates new learning value.
In traditional learning models, the application of new knowledge is either ignored or seen as unproblematic.
But we see the application of knowledge as a very creative act. The application of knowledge itself involves a lot of learning.
It's also the real test of the value of that knowledge.
This we call applied value.
Then as a result of all this, we'd hope to see some improvement in performance.
It could be the person's performance or the organization's.
And this we call realized value because the full benefit of learning has now been realized.
Of course, applying new knowledge may not work. It may lead to nothing or to a disappointment.
But whether it's a success or a failure, this realized value is a useful piece of information from a learning perspective.
So for us, learning is not finished. The information about how it was applied and what happened as a result needs to be looped back.
These learning loops are a key dimension of the model. Learning has to go all the way into practice and back again, and then back into practice.
It is these learning loops that make learning relevant, adaptive, and dynamic. So, let's look at a recent project where this learning model was used. A simple story shows how learning goes through these different cycles.
Honourable Zito is the chairperson of the Public Accounts Committee in Tanzania. These committees are a mechanism for legislators to make sure that there's transparency and accountability in government financial operations.
Honourable Zito was at a workshop in Kenya where he had some good conversation with other members of parliament in East Africa about good practices in procurement.
He picked up something important about the role of the Supreme Audit Institution. They need to scrutinise the procurement process before it's completed.
When he returned to Tanzania, he heard that the National Electoral Commission had procured election equipment, but that the company that had been awarded the tender was the same company that prepared the tender documentation. That was a red flag.
Armed with the examples of good practice from other countries, he was able to convince the Auditor General to carry out a pre-procurement audit.
He also shared the story with the media, another good practice. This added pressure on the Auditor General's office.
Within a month, as a result of the Auditor General's action, the tender, which was valued at $126 million was cancelled and re-advertised.
Later, he told this story at another meeting of his network. This is likely to inspire others to do something similar in their own country.
But there is still more to learning.
This story is not taking place in isolation. It is embedded in a broader project, a project that involves a series of activities with many different stakeholders and perspectives.
It includes networks of public accounts committees in Eastern and Southern Africa, their clerks, the World Bank, GIZ and local organisations.
This means that effective learning involves a whole set of conversations among these stakeholders.
And they need to figure out how their activities fit in the big picture.
These conversations we call strategic value.
And that's not all. This won't happen without certain things being in place. It needs processes, infrastructure,
support, leadership, and technology. Some of this is done by community members, some is done with outside support. But it's all part of learning.
And this we call enabling value.
And there is still one more dimension to our learning model,
Sometimes things go beyond what the community and stakeholders expected.
Learning can generate new perspective and even new definitions of success, not simply improvement in performance.
It might also trigger broader cultural and institutional transformations.
This we call transformative value.
It doesn't always happen, but there's always the potential that it might.
And when it does, it's often the most dramatic aspect of learning.
And potentially the most contentious. An example from the same project shows the transformative potential of learning and its ability to disturb the status quo.
Participation in the network inspired the Public Accounts Committee in Zambia to have its hearings televised. These programs showed ministers being questioned about public finances and became very popular.
But suddenly the broadcast was stopped and the director who'd set it up was in danger of losing his job.
These live broadcasts were becoming transformative, but they were a political hot potato.
And today there's a whole controversy about whether these broadcasts should be continued.
Now, this whole thing, all these different value cycles and loops, is what we call learning.
You might be tempted to think of learning as one or two pieces of it, because yes, there's learning taking place in all of these cycles all of the time.
In fact, people who do training on knowledge management often think of learning as just the first two here, immediate and potential.
But in our case, this is too narrow. For the kind of initiatives we work with, all these cycles are part of the same puzzle.
Our experience is that you don't get real learning unless all these pieces are in place and working as one system.
So how has this model been used since we published the first version?
It started as an evaluation tool. The idea of the cycles was to recognize different types of value. You could then develop indicators for each cycle and monitor them over time.
What these indicators by themselves can't do, however, is to explain how a learning activity is the cause of what happens as a result.
For that, you need to collect many stories of the sort we just told you. An activity leads to an insight, which leads to a change in practice, which leads to an outcome and possibly a transformation.
And these stories connect the indicators into a causal chain. And with that chain, you can attribute some of the observed outcome to the community and its activities.
These days, we're also using the model for planning an initiative. With the model, different stakeholders can start discussing their aspirations at each cycle.
They can also start thinking of the conditions necessary for achieving those aspirations at each cycle.
Some people even tell future stories to show what they expect to happen and to make the vision more concrete.
But to do all this, you need a shared learning model.
We've seen too many projects never reach their potential because different stakeholders don't share a model of learning. Without a shared model, they have no rigorous way to test each other's assumptions.
Even worse, they have different models. One side has a traditional model that goes, set your objectives, try to fulfill those objectives, then you evaluate if those objectives have been reached.
The other side is a more dynamic learning model, and the mismatch leads to misunderstanding and conflicts about what success should look like.
So in essence, what we're saying is this. You need a dynamic model of learning to match the complexity of our times.
This model acts as a shared language to talk about the learning that is desired and the learning that is or is not happening.
And using this shared language, we convene stakeholders to negotiate what they're aspiring to do and what needs to be in place.
This needs to be an ongoing conversation throughout the project.
A conversation about how all the different and changing pieces work together to drive the learning.